Good afternoon. I'm Anthony Hayward, and I'm pleased to welcome you to this session with John Pilger. I was last on stage at Hay with John 5 years ago when my book about his television documentaries was published. Today I'll be talking to him about his new book, Freedom Next Time. In his journalism, his books and his documentaries, John's often challenged conventional viewpoints and shown us events through a lens very different from that which those in authority would like us to see them. So any new book from John's always something to look forward to. Please welcome John Pilger. John, this is a book about how nations glimpse freedom only to see it taken away. It's also a book about imperialism, British and American. The two collide in the story of the Chagos Islands in the Indian Ocean, where the people were expelled by the British government in the 1960s so that the main island could be handed over to the United States for use as a military base. It's a remarkable story. How did you come across it?
Well, the story of the Chagos Islands has been known for a very long time. I first heard of it briefly during the Falklands, when it was pointed out to me that Britain had sent a fleet to go and save 2,000 Falkland Islanders at the other end of the world, whilst 2,000 British citizens in islands in the middle of the Indian Ocean had been expelled by British governments. And the only difference was that one lot were white and the others were black. That was the distinction. The other difference was that the United States wanted the Chagos Islands, and especially Diego Garcia, as a major base. So nothing was said. And that tells us a lot. It tells us something about the ruthlessness of governments, especially imperial governments, and it tells us about the part that the media play in this. Because I remember at the time, shortly after the islanders were expelled, I remember reading about it, that a group of defense correspondents were flown to Diego Garcia to inspect the beginning of this new American facility. And not one of them raised the question, certainly not in print, of where the population was. They'd all been expelled under the most brutal circumstances. I suppose I became aware of the extraordinary evidence of this, the official evidence of this, when files were opened by the lawyers who were then representing the Chagos Islanders in their struggle through the British courts, discovered this treasure trove of official files out at Kew. And there was the whole conspiracy. It's quite interesting. Those who talk about conspiracy theories might like to look at this, because it's a complete conspiracy of how do we get rid of these people from the island so that we can give their homeland to the Americans for a base. And they discuss it in the files, how to lie. One file is described as maintaining the fiction. It's written by the Foreign Office chief lawyer at the time, who was later given an honour by the Queen, which is standard for that sort of behaviour. So it was all there, and that the suffering of the people was almost self-evident, but the reason for it was really cracked this open, and I was determined then to make a film about it, which I did a couple of years ago, and that formed the basis for the first chapter of Freedom Next Time.
So why didn't journalists reveal what was happening at the time?
Well, because most journalism follows the agenda of what I would call the amorphous authority. You can call it what you will, government, authority, the establishment. And it's no secret, you know, you talk to the BBC and reporters about this, about reporting politics, and it's the agenda laid down by Parliament and the Executive and Whitehall, and it's by lobby correspondents and diplomatic correspondents and journalists who are really camp followers with the establishment.
They become part of the establishment.
They become part of it, and we've seen that in its most vivid and tragic form in the run-up to the invasion of Iraq.
Yeah, I mean, the High Court's ruled that the islanders should be allowed to return.
Yes.
Do you think that's likely to happen?
Well, now the islanders, I mean, it's an extraordinarily epic struggle. These are people who'd lived on islands in the middle of the Indian Ocean, were then shipped to the slums of Mauritius. Over 20 years, they fought all the way to the High Court. They got a High Court judgment in their favour in 2000, in which the judge invoked the Magna Carta and saying that you just can't throw British citizens out of Britain, basically. He didn't put it that way, but that's what he was in effect saying. And again, this year, on May the 11th, two judges described the actions of British governments as outrageous, repugnant, and illegal. And so it is unequivocal. It's wrong, and under the statutes of the International Criminal Court, it's a major crime. You can't do that. Now, what the Blair government has done to try and undercut the High Court is invoke the royal prerogative, something called Order in Council, where the Privy Councillors stand around the Queen and they read out apparently innocuous requests from the government, such as new school inspectors for Scotland or something like that. But they tucked away was the permanent expulsion of the Chagos Islanders. Well, now the judges have turned that over. It's hard to think that the government can go on getting away with this, but we mustn't hold our breath, and the islanders are certainly not going to give up. They're not home yet.
No, you've described the islanders as being considered expendable, and it's that theory of expendability that's run through a lot of your work, going back to Eritrea during the famine of the 70s and the aftermath of the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. When you wrote about the starvation in Cambodia and made the documentary Year Zero, did you have any idea of the lengths to which British and American politicians would go to discredit the new Vietnamese administration in Cambodia, as well as effectively supporting the Khmer Rouge? I mean, that was again about propaganda and disinformation.
Yes, I did have an idea then. Most of my learning has been done on the road, and I learned fairly early on. And I think probably reporting from the United States and reporting from Vietnam was a crucial part of my political education. Certainly an understanding, as the great journalist I.F. Stone said, that all governments lie and nothing they say should ever be believed. And I think that's truism, actually, although my favourite quotation, which is from the great muckraker Claude Cockburn, who I think goes closer to the point: never believe anything until it's officially denied. And that is something I learned pretty early on. And so I have, which I believe should be part of the job of being a journalist, a very healthy skepticism of almost everything that we're told by governments or by officials or by vested interests. And in my experience, the evidence provided by ordinary people, if we call all of us ordinary people, but certainly in extraordinary circumstances, it has been reliable, and the evidence provided by governments has almost always unreliable. And I think in answer to your question about expendability, because the media is an extension of the established order. I mean, we have a romantic view of it that, as Burke described it, as a fourth estate, and we're there to check all the other parts of government. That's all very nice, like US Constitution, which George Bush has just ripped up and thrown away. That, that sanctity of the fourth estate has always been a rather romantic one. In my experience, most mainstream media regard most other peoples in the world in terms of their usefulness. So we end up with worthy victims and unworthy victims. Worthy victims, Israelis; unworthy victims, Palestinians; worthy victims, Iraqi Kurds; unworthy victims, Turkish Kurds. And so it goes on. We end up with good tyrants and bad tyrants. Good tyrant, General Suharto, one of the great mass murderers of the 20th century, and bad tyrant Saddam Hussein, compared with Suharto's small beer. And that's really how governments think. So the media really echoes that, amplifies it.
Yeah, you mentioned the Palestinian-Israeli conflict there, which you've covered for 40 years. In the book, you note that 9% of young British television news viewers didn't know that the Israelis were the occupying force in the so-called occupied territories and that the illegal settlers were Jewish. Many believed them to be Palestinians. How do you explain that misconception?
Well, I think we really need broadcasters to explain it, because they were talking about broadcasting. This is from evidence done by the University of Glasgow, by the excellent media unit run by Professor Greg Philo. And they published a number of bad news reports from the Middle East. And that's a particularly shocking statistic. But it's not surprising. It comes out of suffering being graded. You know, some people are victims, are classified as victims, whereas the true victims are classified often as the perpetrators. And for instance, Palestinians are called terrorists, and Israelis are never called terrorists.
Because that suits the politicians in Western governments.
It's the way. It's no conspiracy about this at all. It's just that journalists are no different from any of us, from historians and teachers and those of us with some responsibility for public knowledge. We internalise so much of what our experience, what the national experience has been. And I think that is certainly true in this country, where there's always been a struggle between libertarianism, a libertarian view of historiography, and an imperial view. And the imperial view, although only recently have we started to use the word empire and imperial again. Before that it was banished as a sort of word of agitprop. Now it's back, and I think we're understanding, I think the British public are understanding that there is an imperial project, if you like, that it is run from the major imperial power, and it's supported from this former imperial power, and that colours reporting.
And in the chapter of the book, the last taboo, you call this, I think you touched on the last taboo when you made your documentary, Palestine is Still the Issue, 4 years ago. Yes. It showed the realities of everyday life for Palestinians, but it had the views of many Palestinians and Israelis. Mm-hmm. But after the film was screened, there was an orchestrated attack on it by Jewish organisations, wasn't there?
Well, there were Zionist organisations because it was supported by many Jewish people. So I think we've got to make that distinction very clear. And some very fanatical groups are very good at organising massive email campaigns. We tracked one down to New York where they would send out a generic email which would give the impression that the person sending it had actually seen the film. And these emails will be sent from places like Texas and South Africa and Australia and so on, but none of these people had seen the film. And they came in various forms. Some of them were quite calm and just were wrong. Others were absolutely vicious. And I got many death threats, and the duty officers at Carlton Television were deluged with this campaign. In the end, it forced the Independent Television Commission to actually inquire into the film. So it was successful up to that point. But my producer and I had to write virtually the equivalent of a thesis on the film, in which we had to justify virtually every frame in the film. I've never had to do this on any other subject. And the ITC not only cleared it, but praised the film and vindicated it. It was a very important decision, because it did demonstrate that this kind of technological intimidation, if you like, failed.
Yeah. I mean, how can journalists report the Palestinian-Israeli conflict with perspective? It's a problem that British journalists have with the war in Ireland.
Well, it isn't a Palestinian-Israeli conflict, for one thing. It's the occupation of one people by another. You know, that terrible figure of 9% of people thinking that, you know, I think it's in the same report, that the majority of people thinking that the settlers were Palestinians, that they were people in their own country were actually the settlers. And there's no context to reports. You turn on the news and it's a kind of almost a surreal moving belt, and then up comes the Middle East, the Palestine-Israeli conflict. Oh no, you know, they're at each other again. Well, it's not like that, actually. It's the thing that we objected to most strongly when bad tyrants invaded parts of the world that the British government, the American government didn't want invaded and occupied it. Almost virtually the same United Nations resolutions were imposed on Saddam Hussein in 1990, which had been imposed, quote unquote, on Israel on a number of occasions, and the Israelis just rejected them, and of course with American support they could. So it's double standards, and double standards, like the expendability of some people and the acceptability of other people, that's the vocabulary, that's the language of power. It's not the language of us. And when I say we and us, I don't mean, as you hear journalists saying so often, when they mean we, they talk about the government. Well, do you think we should be doing this? They say, Minister, you know. Well, we and us are people. In the United States, the administration is one of the most unpopular in history, but you actually wouldn't know that. So the we, when they speak about power over there, is the power of people.
Yeah. I mean, you saw the results when you tried to report the Middle East conflict truthfully. If we look all the way back to 1970 and your first television documentary, The Quiet Mutiny for World in Action, you caused a furore at the ITA, which then regulated commercial television. It was a film about disintegration of morale among American troops in Vietnam, and the American ambassador to Britain then complained to the ITA about it. I remember the late Jeremy Wallington, who was editor of World in Action, telling me how he and the Grenada Joint Chairman Dennis Foreman were hauled down from Manchester to the ITA in London and got a rollicking from the chairman, Sir Robert Fraser. They stood their ground and they defended the film very admirably, but as Jeremy Wallington said, they felt they had lost brownie points with the ITA. You were switching from newspapers to television at that time. Was that a shock?
Well, it was a bit of a shock. I mean, I was already a newspaper journalist, and you know, I knew nothing about ITAs and IBAs and so on. I admired World in Action. This was a film for World in Action. And it was a story I'd been working on for quite a long time. And it was about American soldiers, conscripted soldiers, shooting their own officers. I mean, it was the mutiny of a huge army in Vietnam. It was the arrival of the conscripted army and the effect on the war. And I believe that's really got, that and the efforts of the Vietnamese, but that really got America out of Vietnam. But it was just, you couldn't, it was a truth. You know, it was all verified. The witnesses were there, the facts were there, but you just couldn't say it. Yeah. It seems extraordinary now. And the IBA, or as the ITA, as it then was called, was a very political organization. And it became the IBA for many, many years. Before any of my documentaries went to air, I had to submit my scripts, in fact the whole film, to effectively somebody who's an official censor. And they would tell me what I could say or couldn't say. And I had the opportunity sometimes to argue it, but often not. So, but this was so outrageous that we should dare to say that the American army was really falling apart in Vietnam, that Sir Robert Fraser, who was one of those knighted Australians that came here before I did and joined the upper reaches of the establishment, was given some various numbers of quangos, and he finally got this one, said, called me everything under the sun. You know, I was a sort of danger, revolutionary, Maoist, Marxist, all those things. But of course, he couldn't say that publicly. But it came back to the company, and Granada Television, which had produced this film, was then led by Lord Bernstein, who was one of an old guard of great liberal, libertarian broadcasters, who was outraged that this should happen and defended the film publicly. And that was the end of it. And it taught me a lesson. It meant that if you stood up to these people, no matter who they were, you might just get your work through. And that's happened on one or two occasions.
Well, we've been talking about taboos, and another one you touch on in the book came when you returned to South Africa in 1997 in the wake of democracy, and 30 years after you'd been banned from the country by the apartheid regime. The truth you dared to say that black South Africans were as poor under Nelson Mandela as they were before caused what you describe in the book as spirited debate. I think actually it caused ructions, didn't it? The South African Broadcasting Corporation initially refused to screen it. Then they said they would do so only if they ran a disclaimer before it started. And then there was the veteran South African journalist Alistair Sparks, who wrote he was offended by criticism of the ANC. But within a couple of years, there was serious debate about what had gone wrong.
And now it's as the, I have to say, as the theme of the Quiet Mutiny, the theme of apartheid did not die, as a sort of is accepted. It's received wisdom in South Africa. There are big troubles in South Africa. You don't hear about them very much because that extraordinary period leading up to the release of Nelson Mandela and the first democratic elections was understandably celebrated, of course. There was a lot to celebrate, and black South Africans themselves celebrated it. But then it was dropped. Now it seems extraordinary, but there are many black South Africans who actually look back on the last decade of apartheid with some nostalgia. That they then had a water supply, they then had electrical supply, they had just some control over their lives. The ANC government has decided to go a particular route, which is the opposite route of their famous Freedom Charter, and and really obey the strictures of the IMF and the World Bank, and no surprise, that's affected the majority adversely. And I must say, when I interviewed Mandela and asked him about this, it was quite interesting, because we started, and I said, well, how do you cope with being a saint? And he said, well, it's terrible, I can't, I try to, put that aside. I don't like the deference and, the obsequiousness which he used to get, of course, because he's a remarkable man. And in person he's equally remarkable. But the moment I started to ask him some tough questions, I got a bit of a telling off, a bit of a finger wag. But he did say something extraordinary. He said, the fundamental policy of South Africa is privatisation. Now, he hadn't said that before, and it is. And that's the worst policy, whatever you think of privatisation, for a country that has so many people unemployed, so many people with aspirations and expectations that went nowhere after democracy, so many people needing a community-based and state-based help in their lives. That was an extraordinary thing to say. So when the film, he said that in the film, and the reaction divided almost racially, of course. The black South Africans thought it was a great film, and white South Africans didn't. It was quite interesting, because all the newspapers were basically white control, all the major newspapers. So they said they didn't like the film in print. But as I say, that's a view that is no longer controversial in South Africa.
Maybe we can talk about when you returned to Vietnam in 1995, 30 years after you first covered the war, 20 years after it ended. You there found a country controlled by Western institutions such as the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, and a free market based on exploited labour. I mean, did you feel that although the United States had lost the war militarily, it ended up winning it economically?
No, I don't think so. I think that it looked, at that time, in '95, it looked like Vietnam was tearing up all the things that basically they'd fought for, and it was to be themselves, to have free education and a health service, and not to go back to the dark days of the colonial period under the French. Since that film was made, I think it's quite interesting. Although it's basically a totalitarian state without democracy, but from the grassroots, the Vietnamese, being the Vietnamese, have formed what I would call a kind of economic resistance to this, and have objected collectively to the rapacious behaviour of huge Korean companies and Singaporean companies and Western companies in their country. So there's been a recovery in Vietnam.
So it's a bit more optimistic.
Yeah. The analogy with Vietnam is very important at the moment, with what is happening in Iraq. It's déjà vu time again, as there's a massacre which is now being treated and being called as another My Lai. This is a way of regarding it as an aberration. And I did a lot of reporting from Quang Ngai province, where My Lai was, in central Vietnam. And the thing that struck me in interviewing people and making my own inquiries there following the My Lai massacre was that that whole province had been raped, abused, bombarded, and absolutely terrorized, that My Lai was merely an expression of that. And I remember when My Lai finally came out, something like a year after it happened, Newsweek had a front page which said, "An American Tragedy." And just looking through the papers at the moment, we're getting that again. We're having the poor Marines, the poor boys, they're all alone, some are on second tours, inviting us to feel sorry for the perpetrators, for the invaders. And that was the theme of all those very effective Vietnam movies, even the good ones, like some of Oliver Stone's, was to invite us to share this purgative, they're victims. It was a noble cause, but a failed one, and oh, pity us. I don't think it'll work this time, but there's an attempt to do it. When in fact my knowledge of what is happening in Iraq is that it's one big My Lai. And I follow very closely the reporting of those who are unembedded, like the extraordinary Lebanese-American reporter Dar Jamal, who does not appear in any British newspaper, who reported from inside Fallujah when it was being attacked and so on. These atrocities are one after the other. That's nothing new in an occupied country. In every occupied country, and the Russians occupied Chechnya, and the British occupied various parts of its empire, atrocities happened one after the other, because the enemy and the friends always look the same. And the scandal of Iraq was preceded by, almost precisely in some detail, I wouldn't say it's the same in others, by what happened in Vietnam.
Okay, let's take this question.
Yeah. Thinking about Vietnam to the Chagos Islands, a series of world tragedies, which yourself and other people have worked very well and brilliantly on many occasions to bring to the media agenda and then the world agenda. But if we take something like East Timor, which got onto the agenda, media agenda first, then the world agenda with the UN, it seems to me that often they become a ticked box. East Timor was sorted, it got independence from Indonesia, but now East Timor is redescending into chaos, possibly because of Indonesian influence. The media don't want to know anymore, they move on. How do we get the media and the world to revisit some of these tragedies to make sure that we just don't go on to the next one and think, that's terrible, but go back and find out what happened in East Timor?
Good question. For one thing, the media won't do it. I think to expect the media to do it, it's like some people expect a Labour government to do things still. It's a sort of fantasy, you know. Why should they do it? They do tick boxes. You're quite right. They moved on from East Timor pretty smartly after the Indonesians invaded in 1975. And all the horror that happened in East Timor, which we're seeing, the consequences of which we're seeing now surface in the chaos that you mentioned today, was not a story. When I made a film in East Timor in the early 90s, it was the first full-length undercover documentary of its kind from East Timor, and I should have done it earlier. It was a tick box. I think people, especially with the internet, are becoming far more discerning. You can't depend on the daily media. You can't depend on the daily press. You can't depend on broadcasting. You have to look elsewhere. My routine is to get up in the morning and log on, and I go through several websites that trawl the world's newspapers and overnight news and so on. Such is the wonder of the internet that I can go from the United States to India and to get a sense, but I can do it through 2 or 3 websites. Then I'll go downstairs and pick up The Guardian. Now, that's the order at the moment. It couldn't be, I don't watch television news, hardly at all. I mean, either only to monitor it or deconstruct it, and that's work, you know. Getting information from it is just pointless. And so that's my job, and it's not easy for people who are not journalists, although I think most people are pretty savvy about this now. I think there is a critical public intelligence that is so far ahead of the media that understands, broadly speaking, that the world isn't about tick boxes, that our government has a responsibility for much of what is happening in the world, that there are great myths like the war on terror. We're not at war, it's absurd. I think most people, in my experience, get that. But how you get detail of it and how you contextualize it is something that we need to work on, and I would suggest the internet is a way to start.
Talking about the so-called war on terror, the glimpse of freedom in Afghanistan in the wake of September the 11th seems incredibly brief. The big story seems to be the language used by British and American politicians as propaganda. The truth turned completely on its head. Yeah.
Well, that's right. I mean, the philosopher Hannah Arendt talked about propaganda as power in action. It's basically what the great propaganda states like the Nazis depended on. That if it was repeated over and over again and there was action, then it was true, and it denied all evidence. And if you say this over and over again, then you can create an official truth, which won't be true.
But you say that so the people are becoming more aware of state abuses of power and beginning to stand up to it. But in the book, you mention a woman arrested for reading aloud at the cenotaph the names of 97 British soldiers killed in Iraq.
Yes.
How close are we to fascism?
Sorry?
How close are we to fascism?
I think we have to be careful using the word fascism. I think it's too easy to use it. It's too much of an easy, abusive term. I think it's rather more interesting than that. I think there undoubtedly in the United States, there's always been elements of fascism. And certainly what has happened in the last couple of years is the establishment figures, such as the senior CIA man, Ray McGovern, I interviewed in a film a couple of years ago, believed that the United States had fallen quietly, as he put it, to fascism. I'm not sure I'd even agree with him, but it's being debated for the first time openly in the United States, and by constitutional conservatives as well. I've had a recent email correspondence with extraordinary man called Paul Craig Roberts, who was Reagan's number 2 at the Treasury, an editor of the Wall Street Journal. He believes America now is fascist. And he makes his case very well. And he's a conservative. He believes in the Constitution. He believes the Constitution has been usurped, that the 9/11 was a kind of Reichstag, although I think his comparison there needs to be examined. But still, this is being debated now openly for the first time I can remember in many, many years. Probably Norman Mailer had it right when he said not long ago that he believed that America, the United States, was in a pre-fascist period. Now, the way the Blair government has moved against basic freedoms in this country is certainly totalitarian. There's no question about that. The people sitting in Belmarsh or under control orders are no different from victims in totalitarian states.
Let's take some more questions. Is there one down here?
Yeah. I wonder if you could make a distinction between democracy and public opinion, because it seems to me that democracy is something, well, the effect of democracy, we talk about it as if it's something wonderful. And yet, what do we do as the public? We vote once in every 5 years or so, and in between that, millions of decisions, important decisions, are being made. But then they also mention, when it comes to public opinion, we keep on hearing about George Bush. Public opinion for him is down. So what? Is it important? Does it mean anything? And how can we move this thing forward? How can we have more power? Because I'm one of many of those people who went down and demonstrated against the war in London. The biggest demonstration ever. Did it have any effect? Well, I'm sure it had some effect. It gave people the feeling that we were doing something in a democratic way. But I'm beginning to lose faith to some extent, because I think unless I get the facts, how can I possibly make informed decisions? And even when I can make informed decisions, where do I go? Because once in 5 years is not good enough to my mind.
No. I can't answer all those questions for you, but I can contribute perhaps a few things. It did have an effect. I can assure you it had a huge effect. Probably, I would think the reason that Iran has not been attacked already is because public opinion is seen by imperial power as a threat. It must be seen as a threat because they expend so many resources, they lie so much, and they devote so much to distraction in order to influence public opinion. Otherwise, why would they? I think a lot of those people who had marched on February the 15th, 2003, and had marched many times before, might have whispered to the newcomers, it takes more than one march, and it does. And I think the question you raise is very important, because democracy, the word, has been such a noble concept, but has been terribly devalued. I mean, real democracy only ever came from extra-parliamentary activity. It came from the ground. That's not an opinion, it's there, we know it. You know, back to Cromwell's model army and through to the great Chartist movement of the 1830s and 40s, the movement that made the reform bills mean something. I mean, franchise was only won, universal franchise in 1929. How was it won? I would think the Chartists are the most interesting for me, because they defined democracy as the three: political democracy, social democracy, and economic democracy. And without, what we have is political democracy in bits of the others. And we every 5 years we go and we're asked to go and ratify a form of democracy that I think is a long way from what democracy in its modern sense was intended to be. I've just been in Venezuela. It's very interesting, because to hear Hugo Chavez actually quote the Charters and talk about the three elements of democracy, you never hear that in public discourse in this country now. It is not just about voting. In fact, the Charters actually said, if the vote is simply to ratify the same power, then that's undemocratic. It doesn't mean you have democracy. And the Bush administration's idea of democracy, and what it calls its project democracy, is to have a vote as long as the country is totally enthralled and in hock to the IMF and the World Bank, which of course means the US Treasury, and they call it something called neoliberalism, which is capitalism in its most Hobbesian form. You know, that's democracy. Well, it isn't democracy. And what we have here isn't democracy, because the democracy that meant anything, that came to Britain, that was won by the British, came through struggle at grassroots level, and it came through, well, I don't need to run over the past again, but the past does teach us And I think it's something that we have to consider, because this sentimental blackmail, emotional blackmail every 5 years can't go on, and that's one of Mr. Blair's, I think, great achievements, is that he's destroyed it. Because every 5 years we vote Labour again, please. Why? Why? You know, and the why has to become a huge national debate. Where it goes from there, I don't know.
We'll take a question from there and then a question from over there in the middle. Thank you. Please.
I have a question about the future, 21st century. Despite having a regime which is pretty brutal and greedy, America is still the largest democracy in the world, or democracy in the making, as you describe it. Despite committing the atrocities against Palestinians in the occupied territories, Israel is still inhabited by relatively free, intellectually innovative people. But we heard from other speakers in this conference, in this festival, that you know, the next 10, 20, 30 years belongs to China, and the center of military, political, economic power, as well as population, is shifting towards Asia, and China is governed by 3,000 old men who are not elected. And so, how does the future look, in your view, in a world where the moral authority of the West, if it ever existed, has eroded due to the atrocities committed by U.S. and Israel, actually, also?
Okay, thank you.
Well, I don't think it ever had any moral authority. Not among the humanity that I've moved for most of my life. I don't think the West might like to think it has had a moral authority. Tell that to people who have been at the blunt end of Western rapacious power in many forms. Well, you know, again, you're right. That's the received wisdom. China is coming up. India is coming up. And as if we're spectators, we should sit back. China's coming up. Right. New power. Will they fight them? America has a plan. The Guardian recently had 2 pages from the Institute of Strategic Studies, that well-known organization that has been trying to scare us all the way through the Cold War. It had a report saying where all the flashpoints were in the world, China. And it only had that much for the United States, which of course is the biggest threat to everybody. And China was clearly a threat because it's coming up and its growth rate is enormous and so on. I think that doesn't bode well for any of us. It's just more of an imperial power. It's a clash, and certainly modern history is very much a clash of imperial powers. But I think what is interesting about public opinion today as a power is that it's not accepting that. I've never known people to be better informed in all my years as a journalist than they are now. And that may even include a consciousness about how the world ought to be run. There's that terrible word, multipolar. I think they mean that it should be run by various states. Yes, the more powerful, undoubtedly, will have more power. But there's ways of restraining them. I think we're only at the beginning of really working out a truly democratic modern era. And that's for that reason I find some of the events in that benighted continent, Latin America, exciting, because they've come from the grassroots, they've come from the ground up, in the same way that real democracy was nurtured in this country from the ground up. It's a long road ahead, but the idea that we should sit back and just accept some pundit or other or politician telling us that China's the next power, I don't think so.
Okay, can we take a question there?
Yeah, whilst I greatly admire your challenging journalism, Do you not think perhaps you overstate the case of what the non-Pilger media are like? You seem to suggest, if I've got it right, that in the lead up to the Iraq War, everybody went along with the government line. Then perhaps at its most extreme, you said that no television is worth watching, except presumably your own documentaries. Whilst many of us here, I'm sure, are driven to distraction by the bias of the British media, it seems to me actually there are some great newspaper journalists out there who do challenge the government. There are some courageous filmmakers out there doing the same thing. It's not quite as monolithic as you want to suggest.
Well, I didn't say that. I said that I didn't believe television news. There's a distinction. I think your own broad brush is at work here. I agree with you. I think there are some fine documentary makers, and we've seen them in various places, Channel 4, sometimes on the BBC. But in terms of the most influential broadcasting, and that is television news, I don't believe it is worth watching. Now, it might be worth watching in terms of entertainment. There are also many, if you'd like me to list them all, there are plenty of excellent journalists around, and many of them are trying to get into the mainstream but can't. And many of them, I mentioned just one on the internet, the best reporter from Iraq is somebody no one here would have heard of. His name is Dar Jamal. So there are plenty of fine journalists around. Many of them are mavericks, and many of them are physically courageous mavericks. I don't see that we should be celebrating institutional journalism at all. I think that journalists should be dropping their defensiveness, and I felt this often myself, their defensiveness, dropping their clubbiness, if you like, and at least examining how journalism works within institutions. There is a complete barrier to this examination, in my view, in much of current affairs, and especially in the BBC. We are objective, we are balanced, we are impartial, finish. The moment we walk through that door, we rise to a nirvana in which we have these three qualities. Now, we all know that's nonsense. Otherwise, we would be informed, because the public broadcaster is our main informer. And I just would putting it another way, I would invite a real debate about this, and certainly an analysis and a self-examination about what we can do. I do believe that individual journalists and broadcasters can make a difference. As you rightly point out, some have. And I wouldn't suggest that my own documentaries are the only sources of that.
We'll take our last question over there.
I just wanted to return for a minute to East Timor and ask you if you could shed any light on, I've heard reports that the interests of Australian corporations may be involved in the recent disturbances there, especially in relation to oil and gas. I would like to ask you if you could possibly comment on that. Thank you very much.
Well, I think East Timor is just suffering. This country, apart from, well, there are a number of countries, but there are a few more abused and ravaged than this tiny country, which lost almost a third of its population between 1975 and 1999. During the Indonesian occupation, an occupation that was supported and armed by Britain. Britain was the biggest supporter, biggest arms supplier of Indonesia during that. And by Australia. Australia has played a critical role in ensuring that that occupation went on for as long as it did. So when East Timor emerged from this true carnage, it had nothing, and yet it sat on the most extraordinary resources in the Timor Gap. And what we've seen since 2000, over the last 5-6 years, is the most disgraceful bullying by Australia in order to get the lion's share of the oil and gas that are beneath the Timor Sea. Nothing new there. I remember a famous piece of footage of the Australian Foreign Minister, Gareth Evans, toasting his Indonesian counterpart, Ali Alatas, in Champagne as they flew over Timor, having signed what they call the Timor Gap Treaty, in other words, stealing Timor's resources. None of that money, none of those resources have yet reached, in any substantial form, have yet reached that country. Instead, it's had to agree to the equivalent of a World Bank structural adjustment program. So there's lots of unemployment, there's lots of poverty, there's lots of disaffection, lots of bitterness, and it exploded when something like half the army, for extraordinary reasons, were got rid of by the government. The government itself, under Shanana and Jose Ramos Horta, looks, in my view, to Australia far too much for help on this. So it's a country that needs help, but it needs it in its own terms. I don't think any of this is surprising. And it's tragic, but it's certainly not surprising.
John, good luck with the book. Thank you very much.
Thank you.